Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on hidden price tags, how purchasing choices can fuel human trafficking. My name is Christine Commerce. I am the program director for the Alliance to End Human Trafficking. We are a survivor-informed organization that works to end this atrocity by providing educational resources, giving presentations, raising awareness, and engaging in advocacy across the nation. We also support survivors of human trafficking and healing and thriving through financial support of our member houses and providing educational scholarships. Today, our focus is on labor trafficking and our purchasing power. The purpose of our webinar is to educate participants on labor exploitation so they will leave with actionable ways to help identify and how we can make more responsible purchasing choices to address exploitation and build a marketplace rooted in justice. Our webinars are free, but donations are always appreciated. You can donate and find more information about our organization and this issue at alliancetoendhumantrafficking.org. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared. It will also be posted on our YouTube channel, where you can find our past webinars on many other topics surrounding human trafficking. Also, toward the end of this webinar, you will be given an opportunity to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as possible with our speakers. So please join me in welcoming our guests. The first guest I'd like to introduce is Grace Adams, who joined the Ignatian Solidarity Network staff in 2022. She grew up in Rochester, New York, where she currently resides. An alumni of Lemoyne College, Grace has a dual degree in political science and history. Following graduation, Grace spent a year as an AmeriCorps Vista at the Rochester Food Bank, where she assisted in the development of several community health programs before delving into the world of ethical purchasing at ISN, helping to lead the growing movement of Catholic institutions to live out their values in the way that they purchase. Our next guest is Professor Stephanie Richard, who is the director of the Sunita Jain Anti-Trafficking Initiative at Loyola Law School. With 20 years of experience tackling anti-trafficking issues at both state and federal levels in California, she has become a respected leader in the field. Before joining Loyola, Professor Richard served as the Policy and Legal Services Director at the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, CAST, which in this capacity, she managed the largest legal service program for trafficking survivors in the country and led a national technical assistant program for attorneys dealing with trafficking issues. She takes particular pride in her role as a policy counsel for the National Survivor Network and Resilient Voices, an LA-based group of survivor leaders. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Grace Adams, who will be sharing a little bit more about the work she does and the Catholic Purchasing Ethical Alliance.
Thanks so much, Christine. I'm going to share my screen here. All right. Yeah, we can get started here. So yeah, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and to especially have Stephanie joining me today as well to give some more context here after I talk a little bit about some of the supply chain, especially in the apparel industry, which is sort of where a lot of SEPA's work focuses in on. I will say though, I think that like a lot of our supply chains and what we purchase, including like food and things like that, a lot of these, issues that we're talking about, I think can be applied in a lot of those areas as well. But the Catholic Ethical Purchasing Alliance was established about 5 years ago and was a collaboration between a nonprofit and for-profits to really come together under shared values around uplifting people and the planet, especially in the way that we purchase. So my organization is the Ignatian Solidarity Network, which is a non-for-profit advocacy and education organization. We specifically work with young people and really try to uplift the values in Catholic social teaching and trying to bring a faith that does justice, especially to Catholic institutions around the country. And so in collaboration, we have been working with Ethics Merch, which is a distribution company based here in the US, that also has a focus on distributing promotional goods that have also a supply chain that is, ethically sourced. So really, again, looking at worker rights and also how the planet is being treated in the process as well. So we really came together again under, this shared values around people and planet and how we're purchasing, to create a program that can offer a variety of things based on both of our strengths. So we really want to offer organizing and advocacy training on ethical purchasing policies, especially to students, to really uplift student leadership on campuses, as well as networking and mentorship. And establishing ethical purchasing values and expectations, especially in these Catholic communities. So that can include, yeah, large ones like institutions, universities, high schools, and also parishes and other communities there. We also want to create effective purchasing platforms, which is where our partnership, especially with Ethics Merch, comes in really trying to find and build relationships with these vendors that offer that transparency around their supply chain and how they're operating. So yeah, this is just a little visual too of sort of what we try to do here. So we really follow what's called the triple bottom line. So really looking for businesses that don't just have a focus on profit, but really try to look at people, planet, and then profit and how that can all work together in their business model and, this alternative economic, ideology here. So again, we're looking at, worker rights being upheld and also the sustainability of our planet being upheld again in this, process of purchasing. And then trying to connect that again with these like institutions, which can look like many forms and many things. So just to kind of give just a little background here. So we are really inspired, especially in when we're talking about like, what does ethical mean? We are inspired in Catholic social teaching when we're looking at that question. So one of the like core pieces of Catholic social teaching that we're really looking at, and I think can really be applied today, is this dignity of work and rights of workers. And that the church especially says that the economy is here to serve people, not really the other way around. And that workers have a right to productive work, fair wages, and also the ability to organize and join unions. So this has been really important, especially when thinking about Catholic institutions, trying to work around these values that they're steeped in that there is this call, to especially Catholic identifying institutions to uplift and uphold the rights and dignity of workers in the many ways that that looks like, especially today. And then also this care for God's creation. So we really want to focus on our interconnectedness with the planet, and that we're here, we are very connected to the living things around us and have that responsibility to uphold that. So sustainability, especially in the supply chain, is going to be another key piece around, what we're going to be looking at when looking at vendors. So just kind of looking into the reality right now of the apparel industry and what sort of we're seeing. So kind of just on this like larger consumption level, we're seeing about 100 billion new pieces of clothing produced every year. So that's a pretty massive amount of clothes, and many of them don't even make it to us, in our stores. So we have a lot of waste going out. And then kind of looking too at a lot of the realities that especially workers and garment workers in this industry are facing. Looking at countries such as like Bangladesh, which is one of the main textile manufacturers in our world. They also have one of the lowest minimum wages as well for garment workers. So there's a real discrepancy there around like pay. And kind of going into pay as well, that wage theft is prevalent in many facilities, and wage theft is really the act of the employer not by abiding by their contract or what they're legally owing, to their employees. So seeing this in a lot of areas and also in the U.S. as well. And then also kind of looking at intersectionality here of a lot of issues. So about 45,000 garment workers in just Los Angeles alone, largely are migrants from Central and South America, as well as parts of Asia. So there's a lot of different issues there that many garment workers may face today. And then to mention, on sort of what we're talking about today, and I'm sure Dr. Richard will talk about this too, but that early labor trafficking incidents have happened in the US, especially in the like apparel industry. And one case specifically is called the Almonte case, where there were many people trafficked in California to make clothing for brands like Guess apparel. And so this kind of also shows a lot of the sort of realities and ways that like these issues have come into specifically the apparel industry here. So just looking quick at, what we're looking at when we're saying ethically made and what we want to look for in vendors. So for the earth, we're looking at decreased carbon footprint. We're going to look for vendors that keep their production regional, which also helps us with transparency and able to track, where the clothing is going and what facilities are being used in this process. It also keeps the carbon footprint really low, average about 700 to 800 miles compared to a regular shirt, which is about like 35,000 miles. We're also looking for avenues for product circularity as well. So anytime that a product can be used again or made new again into a new product is going to be a really great thing when looking at, like how we can be sustainable in this process. And then on the worker end, we're going to be looking for vendors that are going to be using even alternative modes of operating a facility, like in a cooperative model, especially like a worker-owned cooperative where workers are going to be able to have choices, possibly like democratic voting around leadership, and pay and benefits and things like that. We also really want to work with facilities that are union represented, as that presents some legal protections to a lot of workers that might be harder to get to without a union. And also pay transparency as well. And kind of going into that, it's really important to us that the facilities we're working in are also paying their workers a living wage standard for their geographic area that they're in as well. And then just to kind of show you a glimpse into our community so far. So this is our SEPA community of Catholic universities and high schools and larger institutions that are really committing to this work of ethical purchasing in a lot of different ways. And so, we might be able to have time to talk about some of that today too. These are some of the ways that those universities and high schools have done that, and what we sort of offer as ways for people to participate in ethical purchasing. So that can be a range of just purchasing, from vendors that have this background, all the way to doing advocacy and education on a campus or in a community as well, around purchasing and changing purchasing choices and initiatives. So we really try to offer, that education as well as purchasing are both equally important in this work and in really trying to change the culture around, who we're purchasing from and where our values are in that. All right. And I think I can give it to Dr. Richards then.
Okay. Thank you so much. This is amazing work, and it's the exact type of targeted, influential work that we know protects people from exploitation and labor trafficking globally. What is unique is that with our purchasing power in the United States, we really can impact individuals who are labor trafficked here as well as globally. And my message is there's no simple solution to ending forced labor or labor trafficking. And one of the areas that we need to focus on is really looking at our company supply chains and leveraging our powers as consumers to ensure that we are not utilizing goods, right, that are made with forced labor or child labor. And so just as a starting point, because I don't know people's background on the call, I want to just clarify what is labor trafficking versus labor exploitation. Okay? The good news is that when you take these kind of practices, all of this occurs on the spectrum. So it's really what I call a public health prevention lens, stopping exploitation before it starts and ensuring there's policies in place, right, that prevent it in the future. And then the third component is when you recognize it being there, actually correcting it, right? And making workers whole. But that said, just so you have a technical understanding of labor trafficking versus labor exploitation, the simplest way to say it is that labor trafficking requires, under our UN protocol definition, under our federal definition, and under most state law definitions, that you show that someone is providing a labor or service through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Okay? And what that means is that there's a third party, whether it be the employer, the company, the manager, the subcontractor, the labor recruiter, who is really making someone feel like they must continue working or will suffer some kind of harm. Okay? Whereas in the labor exploitation context, what you have is workers who generally stay in unsafe, not great working conditions because this is the only job that they believe they can get, right? And it can be extreme abuse, like, non-payment of wages or wage theft, unsafe working conditions, even physical discipline. But the difference, and I always say this is, how I explain it to a layman, is that in a labor exploitation situation, you're the worker and you're saying, I can't get another job, and therefore I'm going to stay and stick out these conditions. And we see workers that do that all the time, right? Which is why it's so important that we use our purchasing power to make sure that they're protected. But in the labor trafficking context, which is the most extreme form, right, of labor exploitation, you have the third party, the business, the company, the manager, making the person feel like they cannot leave this place. And again, a lot of times workers feel like this might be their best option, but you have a third party influencing them in a way that they feel like they can't leave. So hopefully that provides sort of a little background on labor exploitation versus labor trafficking. Now I just want to talk about my own experience working in policy in this area and how interested groups like yourself can really leverage your power to change things at the federal and the state level. And so you heard Grace talking about supply chains and focusing on ethical purchasing. But in my mind, companies will remain bad actors because they will profit, right, on the backs of exploitation and abuse. And honestly, their model, right, puts pressure on them to do that unless there is effective federal and state requirements in this area. And so I have worked on legislation starting in 2010 that has sort of put together frameworks. Okay? Now, the first bucket, I call it, is what we call business transparency and supply chain legislation, which has evolved over the 10-year period since I started working on it to include due diligence legislation. So what are the minimum standards that businesses have to do and report on to you, the public? Okay? So the bill that I initially worked on in 2010 in California, called the Business Transparency and Supply Chain Act, did just that. So it went into effect in 2010, and all it did was require on a public place on a business's website, if you did more than $500 million worth of business in California, to publicly post what you were doing to prevent trafficking in your supply chains. Now, if you're a business, you could say, I do nothing, right? But the idea was that you, as the member of the public, would figure out and know who were the ethical businesses. And more likely, though, it would just put pressure on companies who their reputation, right, is their key resource to do something. And I have to say, when I first worked on this legislation and as a lawyer, there wasn't a lot of like enforcement and activity, and it was just, oh, you just have to post. I thought, I'm not certain how this is going to really work. But what was interesting is that, and I was new to this area then, is that it really did create the first dialogue ever with companies, that their general counsel, those in positions of authority, once they knew legally they had to post about this, they started putting more practices in place because then they could post it publicly on their websites. And I do want to say that this, we tried to do this as federal legislation, and it was never successful here in the US. But this California law was adopted both in England as well as in Australia, so that it just shows that the US and our states can be global leaders and influence global markets. So that's sort of the first bucket. And again, all of these I could talk about for the whole presentation. So I'm just giving you a brief overview. The second area that we've targeted for legislation, both federally and at the state level, to prevent trafficking and worker exploitation in supply chains, looks at procurement policies. And for those of you who don't know what procurement is, it is the purchasing power of our federal government, which is the largest purchaser in the world, right? As well as our state governments. And I happen to be based in California, and so we might be the second largest purchaser in the world, given that we're like the fourth largest economy. And so what we have done is try to create a framework for companies to have in place that we know prevents trafficking and labor exploitation before it starts, before they can bid on a federal or California contract. So these provisions were actually adopted federally in 2016. And there had been a whole complex process before then to get them enacted. We won't go into that. But for you, I think it's important to understand the framework, right? So if I'm a company that does over, and the contract's over $5 million or 500, no, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the exact number, but over a certain amount, before I apply for a contract with our federal government, I must certify that I have these really basic policies in place that we as experts in the anti-trafficking and worker rights field know prevents this kind of exploitation. And I have to certify that my subcontractors, so those people that I work with to comply with the contract, also have those policies. So what are those things? It's things like you must have a repatriation policy if a worker wants to go home and doesn't want to keep working for you, right? You cannot charge recruitment fees. So it's very common for fraudulent labor recruiters to charge workers $2,000, $5,000, $25,000 in fees, so that they are trapped in a job because it's the only way they think they can pay it back, right? Other things like having a policy in place, and this seems basic, to not take a worker's documents. So again, these are all things that companies have to have a written policy in place and ensure that their subcontractors do it. And then the other component of the provision that gives it teeth is that if trafficking or labor exploitation or child labor is identified anywhere in that company's supply chains, they have a duty to correct. And what I want to educate on is it's not good for the government, the worker, or the company, right, for a contract to be canceled. So we have to be careful about that as a mechanism. What we want is that the bad acts are corrected and that they're prevented in the future, right? And so that's the framework of this. Now, the federal legislation in this area does allow the contract to be canceled as a last result. But just to give you an example, we've tracked about 181 cases that have been where the abuse has been corrected given the federal standards over the years, with only one contract canceled. And that's what we want to see, because again, it is better for workers, the business, and our government that the jobs remain, right? And the work is getting done, but that we're not doing on the backs of labor exploitation or forced labor. So just as an example of advocacy, so once this bill passed federally, I've been working in California the last 3 years to have the same structure put in place in California. Unfortunately, our legislation just died on the second side of the appropriations committee. So we will be back next year. So if you're interested in this issue, please join us. You can go to our website and see our background information on that. Also, it's something for you to think about at your state or local level, because we have a similar work that we're doing on updating procurement policies in our local for LA County and LA City as well. Again, this is based on sort of the movement that came out of the sweat free codes of context that were really city and county based. So we really can, you know, if we have those kind of connections, these are the types of strategic things we can do. And then the last piece of legislation that I've worked on, and I'll stop there and you guys can ask questions, it deals with a very similar framework, but a different issue. So again, when we're thinking about dealing with supply chain issues, we have to find these very targeted, specialized approaches. So the other area that myself and national level experts identified, you know, years ago was this idea that trafficking survivors, and we're seeing this on our US-based caseload, were vulnerable at the point of recruitment, and it wasn't the business that was necessarily recruiting them, but these fraudulent foreign labor contractors, which, as I already said, created these debts. And, you know, $5,000, but up to $25,000 are clients that I have seen. And that started the debt bondage that led to people's forced labor once they came to the United States, or, you know, these are global issues as well. And all the evidence-based data shows this to be true. So we actually had federal legislation that was proposed, and I know is coming back, I think, next year, so be on the lookout for it. I'm not leading that work this time around. But that will update our federal temporary worker visa system to have very specific requirements on, at the point of recruitment, you cannot charge fees. If you are a third-party recruiter, you have to register and bond with the federal government, so you can't just disappear. And then also, if you're an employer, your responsibility is to use a registered foreign labor contractor or be liable for if certain basic things are not met. And what are those basic things? Kind of the similar things we talked about in procurement, but they're things that a foreign labor contractor has to do. They absolutely cannot charge a fee to workers. They have to provide a contract in their own language that's not just about the terms and conditions of the work, but about the visa category, because they often defraud workers about that. And then they have to provide them information about how do you turn to, where do you turn to for help? Okay. So again, very basic things, but these are all things that we know prevent trafficking before it starts or allows people to get help early on and get compensated. And so, as I said, look out for that federal piece of legislation. In California, we have pilot programs around certain temporary visa categories. So H-2B, which is for unskilled workers. A lot of them work in hotels and landscaping and construction. And then on the governor's desk for signature right now is to cover H-2A. This has been a 10-year battle, though, to get this coverage. And as I said, we started it at the federal level and failed there to get these protections. And so I brought it to California, which gets about 1/5 of these temporary workers as a pilot, thinking that we could enact it here as a pilot, but have been doing these piecemeal approaches because this is something heavily lobbied against by the business industry. But again, that's just kind of the background on sort of the creative, targeted approaches when you're thinking about supply chain issues that makes workers vulnerable, and how you can not just do it from like agreement with businesses, but through legislative actions. So I will stop there and leave it open to questions.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That's some amazing work that you're doing, that you're both doing, both Grace and Stephanie. And I love that other countries are starting to replicate some of these, and we would hope that your efforts are successful, and we'll see other states replicating these efforts as well. So yeah, definitely keep us posted on all the work that you're doing, and anything that we can do to help in any way.
And so I just want to put a plug in
Yeah.
the chat. It does say you can read about our policy priorities. And then if you follow us on Instagram, that's where a lot of times we put up our action alerts if there's just sign-ons or other things you can do. So just the plug, because we do depend on grassroots like you guys who care about that.
Yeah, so I did put that information on the chat. I can also send out, and Grace has some resources as well. When I send out the webinar recording, I will share those resources along with, we have some even resources on our website, some companies and so forth that individuals can use to look at, some of their purchasing choices as well. I will share a quick story because you mentioned Australia, and my husband worked for like a pharmaceutical, and they would do beauty products and so forth. And they got a request from an Australian company that they were looking to contract with, wanting to know what they were doing in their supply chain to address, labor trafficking. And so I just thought that was so great because they were like, we've never gotten this question before. So my husband, I'm like, okay, well, yeah, we're making progress, right? When these companies start asking these questions, it forces other companies to really look at what they're doing and like, oh, well, we're not addressing this. What do we need to do to address this?
That's a
Um,
perfect example, right? Because
yeah.
it's got to be company by company sometimes.
And so that's my first question. And please feel free. We're not taking live Q&A, but feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box and we will get to those. But I'm going to go ahead and issue my first question, which is, what should organizations and companies or consumers really look for when they're evaluating some of their supply chains or their favorite companies? So Stephanie, I know you mentioned some of this, but and as well as Grace, but do you have any specific things that really stand out that people should look for?
Sure. So, the first thing that comes to mind for me, is transparency from a company. I think that a lot of companies are not transparent about, their supply chain. It's usually really difficult to even find, where the clothing is necessarily coming from. And so I think that if you find a company that can tell you, the different facilities that were used or contracted out, and being able to have some stamp of yeah, where kind of it went, I think can be a helpful place to start. I think a lot of times, yeah, companies, are, I think for major companies especially, like a lot of them don't even really know, who they're contracting out or where they are. So it's such a big global supply chain that it's really become this very not transparent system either. So it's difficult, but it's also, I think, something that companies don't want to share either because it's not, a great story either behind that. And so I think that, yeah, if you can find companies, at least at the start, that are transparent around like where they're sourcing their supplies and what their supply chain looks like from start to finish, that's a pretty good place to start.
And I would just add, I mean, this is why legislation is so important because it's really hard to get companies to do this voluntarily. And the ones that are the best actors are going to be the ones that do it. And the worst actors, right? There is an incentive to turn a blind eye. And we know that companies can find like a small widget in their supply chain, yet they say that it's so complicated to find forced labor or child labor. So that the starting point is we don't believe them. But again, I'm not sure that voluntary actions by companies will ever work, right? Which is why we need a united front, because obviously the business lobby wants no new regulations or requirements in this area. My second point is, if there are companies that I think it is hard right now as a consumer to know which are the best companies, and there's debate in the movement around, can you really call something not made with forced labor or goods, like, and how do you do that? So the only project I'm aware of that has succeeded is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in tomatoes in Florida. So that is seen as like the gold standard national model where they can say that we've eradicated forced labor, and it's done by a worker organizing model. Now props to them, and I hope that this can be replicated. But they've been around now almost for 10 years doing this, and I have not seen it replicated. complicated. So it just shows the lift. But that said, if you do have a couple of companies that are big companies that you use regularly, under the California transparency law, about 3,000 to 4,000 companies are required to have that transparency posting that I talked about. So, if you're interested in a particular company, you can look for that. It's supposed to be publicly displayed on their website, so you can easily find it. And one of the things you can do is, if you don't find it, email the company about it, because there's a requirement for it to be there. And they might write you back that they're not required to comply. But again, I think consumers asking about their policies in their supply chains to prevent trafficking, forced labor, and child labor is very influential. So those are my talking points.
Thank you. And that kind of leads into one of my questions or concerns, is, and I think that's where maybe the legislation is so important, where they are held more accountable, because I know you mentioned something about posting on their websites what they're doing to address supply chains. And so I wonder, for someone who maybe does a little bit of research on some of the companies that I may purchase from, I always wonder, I'm like, are they just putting up a good PR page and saying they're doing all this great stuff? Like, how do we know that they're not just, I guess, how do we really know that they're putting the teeth behind the
I think the answer
publicity?
is you can't, right? And so again, but a first step of putting it publicly that they're doing these things in practice means that there is at least a dialogue around it, right? And a commitment in leadership to do this, right? And it is something you'll never know, I think, as consumers, because here's the thing: the best actors, don't benefit if they identify trafficking and forced labor in their supply chains publicly by saying we're correcting it, because it's worse, right, that they found it. But so it makes sense that the best actors, right, wouldn't also be publicly saying this is what we're doing, and I would never expect them to do that. But just know that some are doing that, right? But I think that, on the flip side, that is exactly why, using our legislative and if you identify forced labor or trafficking, you must correct it, and then you must notify the contracting agency. Again, this will all stay not in the public eye, but it creates a system of accountability. And although all contracts are government contracts, these are the biggest players, and so if they're setting standards and looking down their supply chains, you're not going to just have impact on the government contracts, but all their contracts, because we're assuming that they're having these standardized processes in place. And one of the most important and difficult areas is that sometimes it's not the big business, but the subcontractors they use. So having a mechanism to start that responsibility with the big business, right? That it covers anyone you're using, right? Is the best we can do as a starting place. And so I hope that answered your question, but these are complex issues with no real easy answers.
Right. And that's, I guess, some of the challenges that businesses face when they're trying to source ethically, is the complexities of supply chains, right? And so you're looking at, from not only, the sourcing of the actual product to the production of the product to, and so forth. And, so when we have companies like the Catholic Ethical Purchasing Alliance, who's doing a lot of that legwork for us, that makes us easier for us as consumers as well. And I saw, like,
can I say one thing? I just want to push back and say it's hard for business to look down into their supply chains. I don't think that's the issue. I think they can do that. They just don't have the motivation or reason to do it. So for example, when we worked on our procurement bill in California, we worked with an ethical producer called Barry's Chocolates. And they said it cost 0.0000 cent, right, to implement the ethical requirements in sourcing their chocolate. And so that it can be done with low to no cost, even transferred to the consumer, and it can be scaled to much larger things. So again, it's rare to get a company to speak out on these issues, but I want to say that it, from what I understand, it isn't expensive and it can be done.
Right. Well, that's a great point, and thank you for sharing that. And, you know, I was actually just on another webinar before this one, about why aren't we holding corporations more accountable with fines and, you know, really looking at, I'm trying to think of the right word to use, but basically, like, why are we not holding companies more accountable for this issue, right? And like you said, it's not only about punishment and sending out a press release that they, you know, got labor trafficking in their supply chain, but how can they address it? You know, first giving them the opportunity that if it comes out, because like you said, there are a lot of subcontractors and so forth, but like, are they willing to address it? Um, before, you know, going to the fines and so forth. The other thing I want to just tag on to what you said too is because you mentioned the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and they do have that fair food program, which they've found very successful. So if anyone's interested in learning more about that, and they are trying to replicate it in other states, we actually have a webinar called Slavery in Our Tomatoes. And then we also have another webinar. We had them online last year to talk about labor trafficking and what's happening in the agricultural industry. And that's all in our YouTube channel. So I do want to go ahead and before I hand it over to our other questions from our audience, what is something that everyday consumers can do to make more ethical purchasing decisions?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the to me and to SEPA, I think what a big thing we talk a lot about is just our consumption on just, an average, of how much we're consuming and buying on an everyday, weekly basis. And so I think that that's a really great place to start in is kind of rethinking around the way that we are purchasing and why we're purchasing something. And just trying to think a little deeper about like, you know, yeah, why do I need this item right now? Is it, a need, a want, things like that, kind of having a little bit of a reflective aspect to, just why we're purchasing from certain places or from certain brands, what that means for us. And I think that that can be really helpful in, trying to counteract a little bit against just the consumerism, culture that we're in, but then also around these, companies that are not acting right, to their workers. And so I think that's a really good place to start because I think, like as Stephanie had said today, like a lot of these companies, are going to be bad actors until they're legally forced, not to. And so I think it is really hard, to find just for like, everyday purchasing, a great, perfect company doing everything right. And I will say, like, our vendors that we work with, we, have a different processes that we, sort of monitor and figure out, what the way their facility is operating, and things like that. And some of those, are done through our partners and advocacy groups that we worker advocacy groups that we work with. And so it can be a really, helpful step and way to kind of build that sort of like coalition of these facilities that are doing good work and trying to put more like pressure on the ones that are not. So we really do try to work with vendors in that way. But I would say on just the like everyday what you can do, I think a lot of it is sort of thinking a lot about just a daily purchasing habit and what that looks like. And I will share, we have a great resource and sort of like flow chart to help with that I'll share in the email that Christine sends out too.
Great. Thank you so much. And you did mention like all the waste of the clothing, right? So like could we do clothing swaps? Could we purchase reuse, used clothing from consignment shops and so forth as well?
Great options, absolutely. And yeah, we do have to again, I'll send this in our with our website, but we do also have some vendors that we work with that take in, yeah, like clothing and make them into things like quilts and stuff like that. So yeah, there's those are definitely great ways too on the like sustainability end of trying to work with our waste.
Yeah. So, our first question comes from Caroline. She says, do SEPA's purchasing practice requirements or recommendations evaluate certification standards and programs that seek to address supply chain human rights abuses? So, for example, international and the Pakistan Accord, the Dindigul Agreement, the Narapan, etc.
Sure. So the SEPA program really works, I would say, with facilities that have regional supply chains. So largely supply chains that are operating fully in the US is what we're focusing on right now. I think like the global supply chains are the dominant ones. And so we're sort of looking though at the US supply chains, especially in apparel mainly for a few reasons to see, to have that better transparency. Like I mentioned before, like an average piece of clothing that's going to be traveling regionally is only going to be traveling about like 700 miles on average. So it becomes a little bit easier when working with vendors and facilities to track where that clothing is going. And then we also are able to work at certain levels with the labor laws that we have in the US as well to sort of try to hold accountable companies as well in that way and at least have some tracking options available or monitoring options available as well. So I would say that SEPA is not super like does not work super closely in the global supply chain market right now. We're more focused in on the US one.
Great. Thank you. And then Jack was asking, he's tried to get ISM to increase their training in this area, but they don't seem very interested. I think working with local chapters would help. Are you open to speaking in this area?
Sorry, working with local, what was that word? Local.
Local chapters.
Chapters. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, we don't have an official training program yet. I think that it's something that like we're definitely interested in. I will say we're a small but mighty team, so that definitely plays into like what we can offer in that capacity as well. I will say though, what we try to do, at least on the university and high school uh campuses, is really try to work and build up like student, staff, and faculty leadership mainly because we find that, they're the ones on the campus, they know it the best, and also will be really strong advocates to higher leadership and trying to make changes in what their like purchasing policy contracts especially look like, as well as the other, purchases that happen on campus too. And so we definitely try to encourage and build up that sort of like, yeah, you use the word chapter, like sort of like chapter coalition leadership committees on campuses through a variety of ways too. Educational programming is a big one. We also offer immersive experiences for students to go to our vendors and partners, largely in Los Angeles and North Carolina. And so those are sort of the ways we've been able to do that now. But I definitely think there's, a conversation to be had, especially around like, yeah, how can an individual sort of know and be trained in like some of this work too? So thank you.
Yeah. And Stephanie, do you typically engage in different speaking engagements? as requested?
Honestly, not that often, because so much of our work is, policy focused. And so I have like 3,000 partners. We keep up for our policy work. I do host a procurement working group if you are part of an organization that cares specifically about the supply chain issues. Again, it's not for individuals without a sophisticated background in public procurement, because these are, this is the technical details of should this legislation look like this or that. So I unfortunately do teaching at Loyola Law School because I believe in training the next generation of lawyers in kind of the complex intersectional issues of human trafficking. But I don't have the capacity to like speak to local groups. Yeah, sorry about that.
Thank you. That's okay. So Jeff was asking, are there corporate entities, and if so, whom, that traffic human beings from sweatshops in Asia to sweatshops in Los Angeles? I don't know if either you
So
know
one thing I'm going to start with is just a reminder that trafficking does not require crossing of borders, whether they're national or international. It's, we're plagued by the word choice used for human trafficking. So you can be trafficked in Los Angeles and never leave Los Angeles, just as a point of clarification. And so, yes, there are, identified cases of trafficking in sweatshops in Los Angeles and all over Asia. The best place if you're looking for concrete information on where human trafficking has been and child trafficking has been identified globally by country is the ILAB, so the International Labor Division of Department of Labor issues a report on child labor and forced labor that they've been doing since the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed in 2000. And so they list goods that are high risk of forced labor and child labor, and then have an index of actual reports from people that justify that designation. And so that is where I go when I'm trying to see documented cases. Obviously, in the US, we have seen, only a handful of cases that have really gotten public attention in, say, the garment industry. But, in my area, we see that trafficking exists where you look for it, whether it be in construction, garment, nail salons, and we really are not doing enough work to educate the general public about labor trafficking, as the focus has often been on sex trafficking and then its unique dimensions. And what I like to say about this is each industry, right, needs a targeted approach and outreach so that we aren't focused on a law enforcement response, but on a preventative, proactive strategy, and one that meets workers where they're at and is about empowering them and their organizing potential, as opposed to often what we see are raid responses that leave workers, especially vulnerable immigrant workers, handcuffed and deported. So again, a very complex issue, but one where, quite frankly, I think it goes down to resources. So just so everyone's aware, the US government spends more on its marching bands than it does on combating trafficking in the US and globally. And it's like 0.001% of what they spend on our combating drug trafficking.
Thank you. Lisa Lundgren was asking, Stephanie, the first law that you mentioned limited to companies legally registered in California, or does it also apply to out-of-state companies doing business in California?
Doing business. So if you're doing business in California and you have over $500 million of business.
And then she was also asking how can we find out the website where Californian companies are required to explain how they're fighting labor exploitation, trafficking in their supply chains.
Well, there's a general, so the Attorney General has been, in California, has been implementing SB 659, which is the business transparency one. So you can find the guidance issued to companies and their work in that area, but you have to go to each company's individual website to see that posting. Did I address that question, or was it slightly different than that?
Well, I'll assume that you addressed.
Okay. And then again, just go to, if you search SB 657 and California Attorney General, a page comes up that gives you kind of the background of it.
And then Caroline asked, Dr. Richard, to your comments about due diligence legislation and resolving any instances of labor abuses, does that include a clear requirement that companies provide remedy to the affected right hold?
Exactly. And so does the procurement legislation. Like when you say like identify it and correct, it means remediation for those workers.
And what does that look like? What does that accountability and verification process look like?
That is case by case and individualized by the company, but it can be ensuring, right, that wages that weren't paid are paid in full, right? Ensuring policies in place that workers can report more immediately if there's any kind of violation, things like that. But those are kind of concrete examples.
And Grace, how do universities learn about SEPA and the ways that they can become involved? Do you contact them, or have many of them reached out to you? I guess, how does that work if someone's interested in that?
Yeah. So it's been a lot of different ways, I'd say. The Ignatian Solidarity Network has been around for about 20 years now, and has been very connected to universities, Catholic universities and high schools across the country, in our other different issue areas that we work in as well. So we do have a great network around us already. Who has been very excited, about ISN kind of taking a stronger focus into labor and ethical purchasing initiatives. So that's been big. I will say too that a great way to learn more is through our website, which I'll have Christine, send to Christine to send out into the recording here. And our website has a whole host of things, including our monthly newsletters, which you can sign up for through the website as well. Our catalog that we offer to universities and high schools and other communities. And then also educational resources that we have. So we have a few webinars. We have kind of what I was talking about before, the purchasing flowchart, and some other educational tools that should be, readily available, especially for like high school and college level educational use. I will say too, we have a really great campaign coming in November that we're calling Slowvember, as a way to rethink our consumption habits and also where our products are coming from. So that'll have a whole toolkit too for communities to utilize from and to learn more about ethical supply chains and how supply chains operate. So yeah, I would say definitely the website. You can find all this information and more from us. So I will definitely have send that to Christine to send out to you all afterwards.
Thank you. And we hope to see all those stars on your map double as a result of this webinar. So I know we're at time. I do want to ask this last question. As a secondary follow-up to that, can other faith-based organizations support SEPA's efforts? Is it only Catholic, or can other schools or organizations?
Yeah, we would love that. I think we use a lens of Catholicism and Catholic social teaching as a way to inspire and motivate some of this work, and also the work of like the institutions that identify in that way, and sort of calling out, to their values to sort of take action in their values. But I think that, yeah, a lot of these, teachings are found in many other faith traditions, so can definitely be applied and utilized. So absolutely. I will say too that we do have a sort of non-religious parallel to SEPA called By Your Values. And we've specifically been working with UCLA a little closer on that project. It's not, I would say it's not as built out as the SEPA program has been, but it has been something that we've been trying to, work on to kind of offer something also to institutions that are not religious.
Great. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get all of our other questions. We had so many great questions. But if you did have a burning question that did not get answered, I will be sending out an email. And if you want to shoot me an email back and let me know, I'll definitely get the answer for you. I just want to finish up by asking one last question. So for professionals and organizations listening today, what is the next most impactful step that they can take tomorrow on this issue? If you could just take
I was
1 minute.
hoping you would ask that. And so this is, one of the nice things for me after having worked at a nonprofit for 15 years and now come to a law school where I really get to think deeply about how can we change things, right? And it's been something that I'm beginning to write about, and I really believe our faith community could be leaders in, because I feel like they have been leaders in this area. So it's this idea of adding restorative justice practices to corporate accountability. And what does that mean? So it means that, not just that enforcing fines and fees and different things against our businesses when they've committed wrong acts, but actually taking steps to repair harm and have real dialogues with workers impacted to change the culture and then hopefully the future of how these businesses act. And so that is something that I challenge folks to think about, because I think, especially with trafficking, we often turn to a very punitive punishment-based approach, but we know that doesn't work and really change anything around culture and values. And I do think that Catholics and faith-based leaders have been leaders in this area. And this is an interesting way that I'm just beginning to think about changing corporate culture, and I encourage you to do the same thing.
Yeah, no, Stephanie said it perfectly. And I think too, I would just say, any opportunities to learn more, things like this, like webinars, and yeah, any other resources that are out there, I think is just a great way to just keep being more and more informed and kept up to date on sort of how these issues are developing and evolving. And yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, so I'll just add on to that, like joining like the Catholic Purchasing Alliance and the work that they're doing, looking at your supply chains, purchasing school uniforms for the Catholic schools and so forth. And definitely, Stephanie, if you keep us up to date with your work, your advocacy work, we do a lot of advocacy as well. So if people are interested in learning on how they can advocate for some of this legislation, you can also sign up for our action alerts on the Alliance or to endhumantrafficking.org. You can also become a member where you will receive those action alerts as well. And then, I just encourage everyone to just think about different ways they can even bring this back to their parish, from the coffee that you serve after mass, to the every chocolate that you buy on a regular basis, looking for those fair trade labels, which are once again not 100% fail proof, but they are certified. It's a way of certifying certain businesses and suppliers and making sure that workers get a fair wage. So with that, I'd just like to thank everyone for sharing their expertise. Thank you, Grace and Stephanie, for sharing all your insights. This conversation makes it clear that while Ethical purchasing is complex. Every step, whether it's at the consumer level or the organizational level or even the governmental level, truly matters. So we hope that today's discussion inspires our audience to take action in their own spheres. So thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to sharing some more information and resources with you. Have a great day.